Hello, my friends, it's Elena Nikitina, and I'm going to read you the next chapter of my award-winning book, Girl Taken. So let's get started. Chapter 7, May 1995, Valeroy, Chechnya. The trip was already too long. The off-roads, steep descents, and ascents, the car was shaking like a rattle. And with it everyone who was inside. The canvas top of the car was worn out, and air came through at the cracks. The roar of the wind and the motor were stunning. I was squeezed by the militants on both sides. Everything seemed to have jumped back in time several months, back to the night when I was taken away. There was the car, rushing on the road in the dark, and I, alone in the whole world, surrounded by unfamiliar men. Only now I was sure that there was no way out, and there was no hope. My spirit and my soul were weakened, and I could no longer resist the reality. I can't take this anymore. It has to stop. Outside the window it was solid dark. We drove through the mountainous terrain, and I could not make out what was going on outside the window. No one spoke. The jeep roared. There was no sense speaking anyway. I had not seen any of these people before. They looked like ordinary militants, without age, with overgrown beards, dressed in dusty gray-black clothing, armed from head to toe. The machine guns were an integral part of their outfits, of their personalities, of their very beings. I thought that the unbearable shaking would never end, but finally the car drove into a village and slowed down. Outside, in some places, there was a faint glimmer of light from the kerosene lamps. The night was impenetrable. Whoever was behind the wheel of the car knew this place inside out. The car stopped at a low-built house with an open door. A kerosene burner on the table lit the insides of the house. I did not want to be pushed out, so I got out of the car myself and stood in the dry dirt. It seemed like it was a remote mountain village, far from civilization. The air was filled with the coolness of spring, which filled the lungs and intoxicated with freshness. There was no electricity here. It looked like there had never been electricity. The dirt cracked unpleasantly under the thin soles of my pink fabric flats. "Come on," one of my guards said. A few seconds later, I heard the sound of more engines, and two other military vehicles drove up to the same house, illuminating all around with the light from their headlights. I heard men's voices. They were talking to each other in low voices. I was ready to say goodbye to my life right then. I could run forward into the darkness. Then they would hunt me and shoot to kill. And everything would finally be over. Something held me back from doing this. Not now. I was not sure if they would actually kill me. I had to be sure that my attempt to end my life would be 100% successful. The house had one story, was very low, and seemed quite large. I climbed the 2 steps to the porch and went inside through the open door, looking around. I was following the militant who was sitting to my left in the car. In the light of the kerosene lamp, he looked overgrown and wild. I quickly glanced at him just to see that he had a long beard. There was a handkerchief covering his head with an Arabic scarf. He seemed very tall, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, and clad in army boots. He was wearing a military vest with lots of pockets, which were overfilled. His upper body bulged out so much from all the pockets he seemed like he was encased in bubble wrap. He had an accent, but he spoke Russian cleanly. He carried a machine gun on his shoulder. It seemed that in the last few months I had only met this kind of men. They were archetypes, they were stereotypes, each one a painted portrait of the Vainach warrior. In the light of the torch, the house looked like a summer home. The large kitchen, with the table pushed against the wall, and a kerosene lamp that lit up almost the entire room. It was all I saw. The rest was plunged into darkness. Standing in the middle of a room filled with ominous dark light from the lamp, I had no idea what to do next. Grotesque shadows played on the walls. The man's in his vest inflated with grenade-filled pockets, and mine. They completed the picture of horror. The man in the Arab scarf came closer to me and pointed somewhere ahead and to the floor. He indicated a hole in the floor, which had a trapdoor cover, and which was now thrown open. The hole was dark, as black as the night itself. I stared at the hole, the idea slowly sinking in. This pit was for me. I was more pleased than disappointed or afraid. I wanted privacy. Any place would be better than to be among strangers, ready to devour you at any moment. The man lifted the kerosene torch from the table and escorted me to the door. "Stay down there for right now." The words "for right now" sounded like a threat. What did it actually mean? And what would come after? What if I need to go to the bathroom? "Knock, I'll open." He crouched at the opening, lighting my way down to the cellar. A short staircase led from the top. It was only a few rungs down. In a long dress, it was not very easy for me to climb down, the long skirt stuck between my legs. The dungeon turned out to be a small pit, possibly designed for food storage. It was kind of chilly inside. My long woolen dress was helpful, and I had a pair of warm knitted socks with me. The cellar was about a man's height. There was a stack of a few mattresses and a heap of different blankets and bedspreads on the floor making a bed. I stood inside the pit, shocked. The militant held the lamp aloft above me. "Knock if you need to," he said. Then he shut the coffin. His massive boots made a loud sound on the wooden floor over my head. I was left standing in the pitch darkness, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the lack of light. Blind, I groped for the softness of the rugs on the bed and lay down, not covered. The cellar was pleasantly cool. Stretching my legs, I suddenly realized that I was really tired. I was exhausted, emotionally and physically. I had lost all my inner strength. I had no chance to escape, and I was almost buried alive in the ground. And it was not the end yet. I expected something worse and frightfully shocking, which would come for me very soon, and would last until the end of my days. I could not let that happen. I choked back tears, but they rolled down my face, and I didn't even try to wipe them. I was lying motionless, cherishing one single thought in my mind. I can stop it. I was no longer in agonizing fear. Now I knew for sure that I could stop everything at any moment, if I only wanted to. I heard echoes of the men's voices in the distance, but I did not care. I was awakened by the creaking wooden floor over my head. I barely opened my eyes. It was as if they were glued together with dried-out tears. Just before I woke, I'd had a dream. I was hugging my mother. I tried to distract myself from the memory of my dream. I knew it would be heartbreaking. Above my head, I spotted the lid that covered the entrance to the pit. It was made out of several wooden planks nailed together. The rays of daylight lit through it. The dungeon was now very cold. I wrapped and covered myself with whatever was on the bed. The dress felt damp and unpleasantly chilled my whole body. The pit was not lighted enough even with the rays coming in. I had stayed in darkness most of the time for the past few months, so I think it would be fair if I would have developed the ability to see in total darkness, like a cat. The cellar was just a pit for the storage of food products. Now I was stored here. The air was heavy and cold. I felt buried alive. There was nothing else down here but a pile of the blankets. Someone passed overhead with a heavy tread. He came directly to the door and, digging into the lock, opened the door, throwing it with a roar and a squeak on the wooden floor. "You're still alive down there?" His voice had a hint of mockery. "You have to stay alive." He laughed at his own joke. Above me the floor squeaked again. He walked away, leaving the lid open. I did not want to go out. I would prefer to stay down here if I could. But despite my fright, it looked like I had to get out of the dungeon. All that I was able to take with me from Gurchulu were a few essentials, my only property. All of the things I had acquired with the help of Aslan: a toothbrush, toothpaste, underwear. I also had a small towel. I was glad that I already had everything I needed. I would not have to ask my jailers for anything. I could barely climb out of the hole. I had no experience with such things, and I had to learn it. The same guy who was here last night, the man in the Arab headscarf, was sitting on a chair in the corner. His feet in the huge boots rested on the chair opposite from him. Now his scarf was casually wrapped around his neck. His massive head was shaved. In contrast, his beard seemed too long and stuck out crazily in different directions. The machine gun rested across his legs. He struck me as a thug, devoid of any human emotions whatsoever. This one would kill, without regret. I could count on him. The room was a square with one window in which there was no glass, a table, and a few chairs. That's all that was happening here. The house seemed deserted, abandoned. The room led into a small hallway with two large windows covered with mesh. There was an aluminum hand-wash basin attached to the wall with a rusty sink underneath and a bucket to drain the water. Against the wall there were a couple of pitchers. Through the windows, covered by a mosquito net, the warm and fresh spring air was coming in. I washed my hands and face, brushed my teeth, and filled the jug. Without inquiring about the whereabouts of the bathroom, I came out onto the porch to let the drops of water on my face dry. That moment, right in front of me, all of a sudden there opened a powerful and delightful view. Even though I was depressed, I could not help but admire the natural beauty of this place. The village was surrounded by mountains. This house was located in the lower part of the village, right at the foot of the mountain. There were nothing but mountains all around. On the left, a little farther away, there was a forest climbing the slopes of the towering mountains behind it. Nature was so beautifully tranquil, despite the war, and I stared out at it with a fascinated gaze. Even so, my condition did not match the natural beauty. I no longer wanted to be part of this world. I was ready to die. I saw another pair of eyes watching me from the tent pitched out front. I probably looked stunned by the scenery. I hadn't seen anything like it in a long time. I was struck by the beauty and grandeur of the mountains. Everything here was fresh and delightful. It was by far the most beautiful morning in the past 8 months. A warm breeze swept my hair over the shoulders. The insects were buzzing. The birds were chirping, the sounds of life were everywhere. Even so, it was not enough to convince me to stay. Deep inside of me I could feel the dreary call of death. I did not want to be involved in this unjust world. I did not know how and when I would be able to stop it, but I had decided to give up. I was no longer going to fight for my life. I heard a voice behind my back, like a shot. "The bathroom is behind the house." In front of the porch in the yard, there was a spacious built-in sitting area, like a gazebo, covered with a slate roof on the side. Inside it was built fully of stone, as if it was hollowed out of the rocky mountainside. There was a massive table and stone benches covered with rags. There were some built-in ovens like the ones that I had seen in Gurchiloi. It was quite a large gazebo and served as a good viewing platform for spying the area. Not knowing the path, I looked at the neighborhood all around and slowly took a few steps behind the house. I immediately detected the clay structure of the bathroom up on the hill. Behind this house there were a few other houses built one above another, like a procession creeping up the mountains. The path to the hill went through abandoned plant beds covered with weeds. The hillside was dry dirt, almost without any vegetation. The house and the yard were separated from other houses by a fence made of large steel mesh, which in some places was covered with wild climbing plants. The trees here were not much more than bushes. The bathroom was a clay outhouse enclosing a hole dug in the ground. It was located on a wooden platform and had a door made of long wooden planks. From the doorway, the outhouse overlooked the back of the house and the gazebo. Through the narrow gaps of the planks, it was easy to see what was going on inside the gazebo. I could also see the house through the window that had no glass. I could make out the Arab scarf looming inside the house and the barrel of a machine gun pointing straight up at me from the tent. When I was done, I came back down the hill into the house and back down into the silent stillness of the dungeon. I spent a week in the dungeon except for a few forays into the world, to the bathroom and back, with the gunman accompanying me. Someone cared about my sustenance. In the morning, near the cellar on the table, I always found freshly baked bread, boiled eggs, or something else wrapped in a clean towel. The food, especially the bread, was fresh and very tasty, the only thing I was glad about. I did not want to go out into the fresh air at all. I just lay on the pile of blankets and stared blankly into the darkness. I mourned Aslan, my broken dreams, and my pitiful life. I wanted to die right there, to end the suffering, and just leave the world unnoticed. I had to think and plan the way I would die, but I could not concentrate or come up with anything. Being in captivity, with the passage of time, I discovered new sides of my character. In my past life, I had no idea that I could be a fighter, stand up for myself, and not let circumstances break my spirit. For 8 months, I had fought my own war, all by myself. I'd had victories and defeats. Sometimes I did not even know where I found the strength to resist the onslaught. Now I just wanted to give up. I could not see any reason to continue to fight and stay optimistic and good-spirited. I had tried my best to survive and to stay hopeful. For what? To be sold into slavery? To be cut into pieces, my organs removed and sold into the illegal medical trade? Or God only knew what else. I was practically in my coffin already. I had to plan how to leave this world for good. I was so young, and I had wanted so much to live. I wanted to laugh, to love, to embrace my family and people who I adored. If I could not have my life back, I didn't want to stay alive. As the days passed and the more time I spent underground, virtually without moving, the more I sensed the approaching danger. Very soon they would come for me. I did not know who they were, but I knew I wanted to be dead before they arrived. The only plan I could come up with was to try my escape right in front of them and make them shoot me in the back as I ran towards the mountains. There was no place to hide. The whole area was so open they couldn't miss. No one talked to me, and no one bothered me. It was as if they were waiting for someone or something. I liked being invisible, but I felt that it wouldn't last long. It was the calm before the inevitable storm. The sounds that come from above, the men's voices, the car's engine, the squeak of the wood floors, everything I heard caused me anxiety and made me regret that I had not realized my plan yet. One morning I woke up and needed to go upstairs. I climbed a couple of rungs on the ladder and started to lift the lid to give the loud sign that I needed to go out. The iron padlock banged hard against the steel loop at the top. After several minutes of banging like this, the wooden floors creaked and I heard a heavy tramp of military boots. A moment later, the padlock was opened and the cover was thrown aside. Squatting at the entrance was a guy I had not seen before. I looked up at him from the depth of the pit. "I want to come out." He examined me closely with his dark eyes. He was dressed all in black, plain t-shirt with short sleeves, and pants tucked into battered army boots. He was young, though his thick black beard had abundant streaks of gray hair. His head was shaved. He was more handsome than unpleasant. Large dark eyes with a nose that was slightly flattened, as though after a fracture. The broken nose didn't make him less attractive, but instead gave him a manly look. He reminded me of Sergei, who also wore short hair, and his nose was broken too, after several years of boxing. This Chechen reminded me of Sergei so much that my heart shrank from all the sweet memories that came to my mind. They intruded from some other life, one that no longer seemed like mine. I was carried away to those moments in happy times when we simply enjoyed each other without noticing anything around us. We did not care where we spent time. The main thing was that we were together. Each day after I was done with my university classes, I could not wait to see him. We hung out in the cafes, went strolling in the park, or just sat around the house and chatted. Sergei was from a nice family, very polite young man. Older than me by 2 years, he had established his own business selling cars and had successfully developed it. My mother adored him. His charming sense of humor could win anyone over. He looked after me beautifully and tenderly. We were both whimsical and explosive. If we happened to quarrel over trifles, we did it vigorously and passionately, but then we immediately made up with even greater passion. The man who opened the lid of my dungeon did not have the same tender feelings towards me. He just watched my actions as if I was a monkey at the zoo and enjoyed his power over me. On both sides of his body there were 2 holsters where pistols dangled. It was strange to see someone without a machine gun. He did not seem ordinary village boy. He was well kept and tidy. Maybe he was a mercenary. "Do you mind if I come out? I need to use the bathroom." After a long pause, I repeated my question again. "Crawl out," he said. He spoke cheerfully and without an accent. He spoke in such a friendly way, it was as if we had known each other for 100 years. He was definitely not local. I awkwardly walked up the stairs and sat down on the edge of the wood floor, legs still hanging into the hole. My handkerchief was resting on my shoulders. I always wore it on my shoulders so that it was always with me, and I could cover my hair if I needed to. I felt more comfortable having my hair covered. I drew less attention. My hair grew down below my shoulders, and its blonde color was way too light compared to the dark hair of the Chechens. I put the handkerchief on and stood up to my full height. Spring was here. The air got warmer every day. It was so nice to feel the fresh air after a heavy night underground. I went into the narrow hallway towards the sink. I brushed my teeth and washed my face with cold water. I filled the jug and went out. The new guard, because of his shaven head I thought of him as sheared, followed behind me. Nothing had changed except for the guards, and maybe the guards weren't even new. Lately I had been in a coma. Just today I seemed to be getting my senses and vision back. As I climbed to the outhouse, I heard a man's voice talking somewhere nearby. Upon returning, I stayed in front of the porch for a second. A strange thought occurred to me. "Do you mind if I sit here for a bit?" I said. He thought for a moment. He shrugged. "No." He went to the gazebo and sat down on the bench without taking his eyes off me. I sat on the wooden porch in front of him and breathed deeply. I could not get enough of the fresh morning air. It was warm and it was beautiful. On the left, a bit further on the hill, right before the forest, I could see a neighbor's house, white with the same reddish roof and mesh fence surrounding it. All kinds of sounds filled the earth in this hour of the morning. The murmur of a mountain stream, the play of birdsong, and crackling of insects were coming from somewhere. I was surrounded by the mountains on all sides. It seemed that I was on the edge of the earth. What is behind these mountains? What if I run now? Where? Over the fence? Jump over the fence in this long dress? Which direction do I run after that? Thousands of questions flooded my mind, and I could not give a precise answer to any one of them. What would happen to me if I got caught instead of being killed? From the house next door, a woman came out, stopped at the fence, and looked straight at me. What did she know about me? What would happen if I asked her for help? Sheard did not seem worried that the woman saw me. What was wrong with these people? Did their beliefs allow and encourage them to deprive an innocent human of her freedom? The woman wore a long dress and a tight Chechen scarf around her head. She continued to stare at me. There seemed to be pain in her eyes. Or maybe I just thought that, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I was too far away to see the feeling in the eyes of a complete stranger. A group of men came out of the house behind her. I did not linger on the porch so as not to draw attention to myself. I went back inside. Bread was waiting for me on the table. I climbed down into the pit and Sheard cranked the key in the lock. In the evening, I went out again for a quick bathroom visit. Sheard was still there. My heart sank when I saw a group of militants under a canopy. They were talking. Upon my appearance, they seemed to start talking about me. A wave of fear passed through me as I walked uphill, the feeling of impending disaster. The sun had set. The thought of new painful experiences in the near future, perhaps more terrible than before, caused me an internal conflict. I struggled with myself. Was it worse to me right now to jump out of the bathroom and run, hoping that they would shoot and kill me? My suffering would end immediately. But what if they did not kill me right away and only hurt me? Then my suffering would start in the worst way. I would be dying in torture, slowly bleeding in agonizing pain. But I could no longer stand the life imposed upon me either. Oh God, why was this so hard? To plan your own death is not easy, especially if you don't really want to die. I had always made choices as I was advised by my inner voice and intuition. Once again, it told me to skip this battle. I did not run away. It was a stupid plan. I had to do something that would give me predictable results. The stars in the sky began to light up one after the other. Their distant beauty moved something inside me. Suddenly, I wanted to stay here for a second and look at the starry night. Before I descended back to the cellar, I asked, "Can I stay by the window for a minute?" He was not a jerk, this guy. It was clear from the start when I saw him the first time. He looked like Sergei, so he couldn't be a jerk. Now it was confirmed. "Okay," he said. He sat on the floor, near the wall, and began to light up the kerosene lamp in the impending dusk. I stood next to the window, where there was no glass. The pleasant night's coolness had replaced the day's hotness. I stood in the darkness, turned my back on the guy, exposing my chest and face to the stars, which were slowly popping a light here and there. I felt so incredibly wonderful to be in the dark under the starry sky, which had no end. What a pity that I had to leave this world and without even a chance to understand why I was born. I felt euphoric. There was no single human sound now. The moist spring air filled my lungs, intoxicated, and carried away to some unfamiliar reality. The night on earth struck me and filled me with joy. The tranquility was only broken by the pleasant sounds of the night. I could hear the mountain river flowing, cascading downhill, somewhere far away. The night birds called. I wanted to soar high into the sky, all the way to the stars, and fly away from here, home to my mom. I looked at the dark and starry sky with my eyes wide open and thought that somewhere she might also be looking at the same sky and see the same stars, and prayed to God for me to be returned home. Mama! Suddenly it was clear to me, how could I dare to think of dying? I could not do that to her. I would not lose hope. I would not lose faith. I would find a way to escape, not to get myself killed, but only to get home. Silent tears of sudden illumination flowed down my face. It was as if scales had fallen from my eyes, and only now I could see clearly. I had just realized a new way to get out of the captivity. That night I did not sleep at all, struck by this new idea. All new strength had come to me from somewhere above. I felt that I had made another victory over my own self. I needed to escape, but in a way where they would not notice me or shoot me. It was almost impossible to do, but I had to find a way. All night I pondered the options, but none of them seemed like they would work. Now I had to find a way to be outside as much as possible. Every morning and evening, going to the bathroom, I quietly watched what was going on around me. I had only a few minutes to scout out everything carefully. At least 2 militants were always there when I was out. One of them was always close and near. In the evening, from down in the pit, I heard men's voices and the sound of cars departing. Early in the morning, the sound of men's voices resumed. The militants were hiding in the mountain villages by day and conducting their brutal guerrilla war in the night. Most likely, this village was one of their hideouts. Often from the porch I noticed the neighbor woman. Our eyes always met. The neighbor, it seemed, was either always there or would come out and wait for my arrival. The neighbor woman was watching me, and I did not know if it was pity or hatred. In those rare moments when I was able to stay on the porch longer, I could see a group of militants leaving her house. Perhaps she was cooking for them, and one of them was her son or a husband. She had 3 young sons, about 8 to 10 years old. They became frozen at the fence with their mouths open when they saw me. One morning, on the way to the bathroom, I suddenly heard the neighbor woman's voice. She spoke to my guard over the fence. I never heard her speak before. On the way back from the bathroom, the guard told me something that put me in a real shock. "She's calling you to her house to have breakfast." I could not believe my ears. I was ready for anything but not for a manifestation of human kindness. I almost imagined it was some kind of trick. Over the past 8 months, I had been on a long journey, one where I had to deal with many different people. It was as though, when you least expected, the good people would appear from nowhere. Was it God's work? I did not know. The Chechen people, they had appeared in my life out of nowhere, as if they were materialized from a parallel world, one which I did not know about until I woke up in a dark car on that fateful night. New faces appeared and completely filled the space around me, trying to force out the memories of my past life and everything that was dear to me. People kept entering my life, and it scared me. I did not know what they would bring, new pain or salvation. I wanted to see compassion in each one, imagining the fairy tale with the happy ending. But each time this dream was broken on the rocks of reality. People who seemed good at first glance would later turn into the cold-blooded monsters. They also could remain good, but up to a certain limit. I had met a few good people here, but they could not help me. Despite that, I still wanted to believe that there were no good or bad nations. Cruelty and kindness can take place in any of them. The guard escorted me to the woman's house, and we stopped at a summer kitchen under a canopy with a large table covered with a tablecloth. The stove was lit with coals, and in a frying pan there was something that smelled delicious. I had smelled the woman's cooking a few times before in the air. Each time, in my imagination, it brought me home. The guard sat nearby. The neighbor did not say a word, and I did not speak either, but somehow I felt her good intentions and the warmth of her heart. I realized that she knew everything about me. I could read it in her eyes. A woman without age, in a long dress and a scarf tied around her head. She looked like a typical Chechen woman who never knows fatigue or rest. She fed her men, and now it was time for the women to have food. I have learned that in Chechnya, the men and women are not supposed to sit at the table at the same time. She looked at me with pity in her dark and tired eyes, just like when I saw her on the porch for the very first time, and I was not wrong then. Even from the distance, I could see the true compassion. She stared at me, gesturing, kindly pointing me to a chair. I thanked her and sat down. She brought a hot skillet full of fried eggs sprinkled with cottage cheese. The taste of the food was amazing, and I enjoyed every bite of it. She brought out hot, freshly baked bread, the same as I found every day on the table near the pit. I wanted to cry from her kindness. She sat at the opposite side of the table, did not eat anything, and stared at me. I could not read her mind, but in her eyes I saw something deeper than even compassion or pain. I was so grateful, and I was sure she could read it on my face. I did not want to leave her home. It was something peaceful and hopeful, something that I missed so much. That night in the dark, a realization came. She knows what the future holds for me. That would explain her compassion. Even so, I could not wait for her to call me again. Time went on, and I could not find a way out. The more time passed, the less time was left to escape. I felt the approach of something terrible right around the corner. The gunmen were waiting for something. None of them were familiar to me. I had seen none before in the previous places. They were a completely different group. I wondered what kept them from hurting me. It seemed to me that I had been sold, perhaps, into slavery, and they were waiting for a convenient time to ferry me to my new owner. Nothing else seemed to make sense. Clearly, they did not intend for me to live here underground the rest of my life. The thoughts made me paranoid. Each creaking floorboard above my head terrified me. I had horrible dreams. I constantly dreamt about my mother. I did not know whether she was still alive and healthy. The dreams shattered my sleep, and I would awaken in tears. My mom and I were both crying in my dreams, tears of grief and sorrow mostly, but sometimes tears of joy. It was impossible to get out. Armed bandits kept an eye on me at all times. The only chance for escape was my trips to the bathroom. I examined the structure made of clay for a few days. The roof was too high. I could not jump that high to try to get through it. Without a ladder or chair, it was impossible for me to reach it. A few days later, the neighbor called me again. By now, I had realized that my regular guard was her husband or brother. That was how she was able to persuade him to let me come over. He was a big guy, one of those who brought me here from Gurchuloy. He wore his Arabic scarf all the time. He looked ageless and threatening and sounded bossy and loud. The second militant stayed at the gazebo, and I was guarded just by the scarf guy. My second visit She kept me at her house much longer. She spoke a little Russian, although with great difficulty. She spoke a single phrase at a time, but I understood her perfectly. My name is Lila. I tried to thank her for her kindness and tell her how delicious her food was. I was not sure how much she understood. She smiled back at me, and that was enough. I wanted to scream for help, to throw myself at her feet and beg her to help me escape. But I could not kill my chances. She was one of them, even though a very kind one. She probably could not help me anyway. This was a war of her children, a war of her country. What would happen to her if she tried to help me? I could not let her suffer because of me. The front was slowly moving towards us. I guessed that the Russians wanted to lure the Chechen fighters from their mountain shelters. Would they kill civilians? Since Aslan had died, I did not know anything about the war. In the pit, sometimes I could hear some strange sounds. I did not know what it was at first, but right away this distant, muffled thunder terrified me. It made my heart sink from a sense of helplessness. The sounds were flat, far away, and lifeless, like someone randomly beating a heavy African drum in the distance. I almost could not hear them at all. I did not fully understand what was happening. I had not seen the bombing up close and could not identify it by ear. But gradually I realized, and then I knew. What else could it be? It was a voice of war. I could not help but focus all of my attention on them. Everything else ceased to exist. Only the sounds, like sinister musical instruments, mystical drums, untuned, dull, they promised nothing but horror and pain. Even later, when the beating stopped and a dead, ringing silence covered the earth, the far-sounding drums remained in my memory, like an obnoxious and evil symphony, a constant reminder of my youth that was taken away, and the deprivation of the right to live, the right to love. I did not want to believe that there was no way to escape, but a new problem had arisen as the bombing came closer. If I was not killed by the militants, there was a good chance I would be killed accidentally by the Russians. I had to send a message to the Russian troops and let them know I was here. But how to do that? May 1995, Astrakhan, Russia. It had been almost 8 months. The woman avoided family and friends. She hated them because they could live without her. Friends did not call so often anymore and were not interested in the latest news about her daughter. There was no more news anyway. Everyone got used to the fact that she was gone. All of them except her. She refused to accept her daughter's absence. Even if 100 years passed, she would wait for her child and she would hope for her return. The police formally continued to search for her daughter in Chechnya, hoping that someone would accidentally discover the place of her confinement and inform the Russian troops if she was still alive. They could do no more than this. Chechnya was a bloody mess. Against a backdrop of mass killings and the disappearance of hundreds of people, the chance of finding one missing person was reduced to 0. Was she alive? Only God knew. The woman begged him to give her a sign. She prayed for hours, to oblivion, to blackouts, begging God to bring her back. Since mid-February, she had not received any phone calls from the terrorists. They were gone, and the connecting thread was gone with them. She prayed. She believed, and she received a sign. The sign came in the form of an elderly woman, one of the parishioners in the church, with the beautiful name Taya. She unexpectedly came up to the woman and stared into her eyes. Seemed like Taya could read the inner pain and anguish in her eyes. "What happened, child?" The woman began the story. She had told it many times, but this time felt different. My daughter had been taken. Taya listened to the tale. At the end, she gave the woman 9 church candles. "Light up one of them every night and let it finish," she said. "Believe and hope. She will come back. Do not let hope die." When no hope remains, a person will cling to any thread, even if it's incredibly thin, in order to go on living. So the woman believed Taya. Later, the woman grew impatient for the night to come so she could light the first candle. She sat next to the candle in the dark, watching it cast long dancing shadows on a wall. She sat with it until it burned down completely, and the entire time her eyes did not shed a single tear. There was something mysterious and attractive in that flickering light. Was Taya a witch? It did not matter. The task she had given the woman inspired strength and hope. Each new morning she could hardly wait for the night to come. This magic ceremony was going to be the answer. It would bring her daughter back. She found herself investing all of her faith into it. She would sit next to burning candle and gaze out the window, and she would feel in her heart that the day was approaching. Her beloved daughter felt closer as every moment passed. Then she was down to only one, the 9th and last candle. She lit it in awe and terror. She believed in omens and in the signs she was receiving. Her whole present world was concentrated in this last candle, and it could hopelessly collapse. Days had passed since she watched the last one burn down, and nothing had changed. Despair began to conquer her fading hope. Every night, when she could not fall asleep, the woman drew the heavy curtains wide open and looked out the window. She turned her eyes up the sky and cried out to God. Looking to the distant, endless dark space, she was overcome by a feeling. It seemed that somewhere far away, her lonely daughter was looking at the same stars and thinking about her. June 1995. Valeroy, Chechnya. I waited for Lila's invitation every morning. I hoped she would call me again, but she did not, and I had not seen her in a while. Her tall and scary relative had not shown up either. Every morning and evening, I jumped out of the pit and hurried outside trying to find Lila, searching with my eyes scanning all around. Finally, some days later, she reappeared, standing at the fence. She waved me over. Soon I was once again in her home having late breakfast. Being there made me happy and grateful. It gave me a sense of normalcy that had long been missing from my life. We were neighbors, she and I, only she lived in this pretty, open, wood-framed home, and I lived in a dark pit underground. But she did not treat me as a prisoner. She treated me as her guest. It was a beautiful feeling and civilized feeling to be a guest in someone's home. If only I could do something for her. I noticed a pile of undone dishes left after the whole group of militants had eaten, I guessed. For a long time I had been missing everyday trifles, simple, small home chores. There was a large basin of water on a big boulder prepared for washing, and I said, "May I wash them?" Her little sons were spinning around behind the fence. The guard seemed to have dozed off under a canopy. Lila nodded in agreement, and then quickly came up to me, took something from her apron pocket, and quickly hung it around my neck. I jumped back in surprise, but then I saw that it was a delicate lace string with a tiny, stitched brown leather bag hanging from it. "Wear it," she whispered. "It will help you." I quickly hid the tiny pendant under my dress collar. We washed the dishes in silence, and I could not stop thinking about this leather pouch. What was in it? Lately I slept very little. In those short oblivion moments when I drifted off, I had dreams about my mother again and again every night. Then I woke up in the dark, choking back tears in desperation. That one morning before sunrise, I heard footsteps right over my head. I really wanted to go upstairs. I didn't know what time it was and whether someone would open the door for me at such early hour. I went up on the ladder and knocked on the lid. The door lifted a tiny bit, making the loud sound of the iron lock hitting against the loop. Someone was in the house, in the vicinity of the cellar. The lid soon was lifted, and I saw Lila's relative. I was delighted and hopeful. His presence was always a chance I could go to her house. It was too early for breakfast. The sun had just begun to rise, weak sunlight peeking from the horizon behind the mountains. I was hurrying up the hill with the guard at my back when I noticed Lila in the yard near her house. I wanted to let her know that I was also up, in the hope that she would invite me to her home earlier than usual. I hid inside the outhouse. Everything seemed different in the twilight. It was still dark, and the guard was waiting at the fence. The sound of arriving cars cut the morning silence. Through the gaps between the wooden planks of the toilet door, I saw 2 military cars stopped out front, green with canvas roofs. Despite the darkness, the headlights were off. A few men disembarked from the cars and dispersed. The militants had returned from a night operation and had gone into their shelters to rest. I would like to see Lila. She noticed me on the porch and nodded to me. In the darkness, I looked right into her eyes. "Lila, can I help with the housework?" I shuddered as I asked, quite sure that my request would be denied. The sleepy guard dropped a few words with Lila. Unfortunately, I still could not understand their language. I knew a few words of Chechen that Aslan taught me, but mostly I sensed the language by the tone of the voices. Lila spoke slowly and persuasively, almost hypnotically. The scarf guy, on the contrary, had an intimidating low voice and spoke fast, but she knew how to convince him. I had been there, under their supervision, for about a month. The whole time I had showed myself as very quiet, scared, and broken. I did not need to pretend it. The captors grew accustomed to seeing me helpless and pathetic. Recently, my inner state has changed, and I would like them to continue thinking that I was still miserable and weak. I wanted to show them I was well and truly beaten. I was helpless. I was impotent. I need to finally put their vigilance to sleep. The guard's supervision began to weaken. The militants had more on their minds than me. Their thoughts were filled with the war and blood, and possibly with the very real prospect of their own impending deaths. They still watched me, but the effort was already less careful, less close, with eyes that were less suspicious. It seemed like they were just going through the motions. Today I was in the backyard of Lila's home. I was like a balloon drifting out of their sight. I had never been so far away from my underground pit and from the guard tasked with watching me. It felt amazing, like a breath of freedom. There were farmyard hens and a barn in the back. The yard reached to the cliff, with a low mountain creek running through it. I had not seen it before, but had always heard its peaceful murmur. We were surrounded by towering mountains. To the left of her house, a forest climbed deep into the space between them. The small village, just a few houses, seemed perfectly hidden down there. Lila's house was the closest to the woods, separated from it by a low fence. I kept glancing at the forest, trying not to stare. It was dense, almost black, an army of trees standing close together like a wall, a dark and foreboding forest from a medieval children's tale. Hansel and Gretel could disappear into such a forest. Perhaps I could as well. Half of the barn had been converted into a garage where one of the jeeps was kept. A lonely cow grazed near the house, right next to the forest belt. The spirit of freedom intoxicated me. Having appeared suddenly in this new territory, the thought pierced me. Run, Right now. I would not make it across the mountain stream unnoticed, but the forest, if I reached it, I would disappear. The feelings electrified me. I had only to wait for the guard to be absent for a moment or for a lapse in his attention. I turned to Lila. "What can I help you with?" I said. I was going to go for it. I was 100% sure. The idea made me feverish with excitement and thrill. Seeing me busy with household chores, helping Lila, I had hoped that the scarf would weaken his attention for a second. Lila's 3 young sons played nearby. The sun was rising, and the day was promising to be beautiful and warm. 2 ideas were at war in my mind. One very simple thought, run, and a much more complicated jumble, a plague of questions and fear which made clear the absurdity of the first idea. Lila distracted me from my inner struggle. She handed me an empty bucket and gestured at the cow in the field. "Milk," she said. A moment later, I was standing about 15 feet from the animal with the empty bucket in my hand. This was the closest I had ever been to a cow. Previously, I had seen cows from afar, and they always seemed like quiet and calm creatures, peacefully grazing the fields, slowly chewing the grass, carelessly looking around. My grandmother had a small farm, which consisted of a single huge pig named Borka. I was young then and never approached the pig closer than 10 feet. I was not allowed to go any closer. Then something bad happened to Borka, the thing that was supposed to happen, and the reason he was there from the beginning. I was very sorry for the huge hog. I cried when I learned that he was no longer with us. I slowly approached the cow with the bucket and noticed her nostrils, which seemed to flare like the nostrils of a bull in bullfights somewhere in Spain. She looked straight at me. It seemed that in a second she would start to beat a hoof on the ground and rush to attack me. She appeared to read my mind and knew what I was thinking about. She definitely felt my fear. Many times in the movies and cartoons I had seen how easily the farm people milked the cows. It was only necessary to approach her confidently and begin to pull the udder. They say that animals know when someone is afraid of them, and then they begin to feel superior. I could not let that happen. I walked quickly up to the cow. I pat her back and showed that I was the boss here, letting her know that everything was fine and calm and letting her know that she was about to be milked. She was just peacefully standing there, chewing slowly whatever she had in her mouth, lulling me into a false sense of security. She showed me that she agreed to our new relationship. My heart started melting at how cute she was, when, all of a sudden, she shook her long tail like a whip in my direction. It was very unexpected. Any sudden movement at a time when you are already so alert immediately stimulates the instinct to flee. I screamed and jumped back 5 steps, dropping the bucket on the ground. Someone burst out in laughter behind me. I turned and there was Lila. The cow seemed totally careless. She kept moving her tail around, just fighting off the annoying flies around her butt. I burst out laughing too. Lila confidently took the bucket from the ground, squatted down on her haunches, and began to quickly and nimbly milk the cow, showing me how to do it. The cow seemed calm and happy. I sat down close to Lila and tried to pull the cow's udder, squeezing warm milk in the bucket. It drizzled in different directions everywhere but the bucket, but I was not appeased. After some time, I got the hang of it, and the task was accomplished. I was covered with splashes of milk, but the bucket was almost full. This short but funny episode made me forget about my intention for a few moments. Lila was a good mother, a good person, and I was very grateful to her. But I wanted to go home and be among the people that I loved, there where I belong. Trembling with excitement, I decided to run right now. Contrary to my cowardly inner voice, I filled a pitcher with the water and stepped closer to the fence. to clean my hands and dress. I had never been so close to the forest and to my dream. I tried to drown out my inner voice, which was screaming no. Adrenaline overwhelmed me. I had never been so close to the goal. This was my chance. Uncontrollable excitement evolved my whole being. Everything around me took on a surreal cast. I could hear my own heart beating, super slow and extremely loud. I could hear the sound of insects tunneling in the ground, and the world seemed to move in slow motion, growing slower and slower all the time. I washed my hands as centuries passed. Nearby, the trees in the forest swayed in the breeze, moving with the same infinite slowness of the snails crawling on their trunks. I watched what was happening, searching for the smallest details, looking for the one piece of evidence that would say to me clearly and without doubt, "Run, run now!" Lila's little boys were playing near the guard and the vehicle. The scarf did not seem to pay any attention to us. I was pretending to carefully clean my dress of the milk splashes. Lila put the satisfied cow into the barn, then picked up the bucket of milk and headed toward the shed with it. My heart pounded furiously. I was ready to make my move. My brain was on fire, the synapses twitching and sizzling. But then something changed. An ominous silence suddenly descended. It came from everywhere and descended upon me, fully covering me like a heavy blanket, like invisible hands pressing against my ears from both sides. It was as if, for a split second, every sound in nature had stopped, including my own heartbeat. You could feel the fear and anxiety deep inside you. Something powerful and deadly was just about to begin. In the deep grass, the crickets were not chirping. The sheep had stopped bleating. The cows were quiet. No small birds called from the trees, and no great hawks cried out from the sky. Nature herself was paralyzed in terror. Then there was a hissing whistle. Its shriek so loud that it penetrated like knives through my ears and shattered my brain. It struck fear into me that I would never forget. If you ever hear that sound, you will remember it for the rest of your days. Everything happened fast, but seemed to take a long time. There was a sudden flash and explosion somewhere very close, in the forest. Under my feet, the earth did not merely tremble. The very ground was lifted up and then put back down by the blast. The Russians were attacking. I saw Lila, her eyes wide, her young face a mask of horror. She dropped the bucket, rushing to pick up her screaming children. The white stream of the milk poured onto the ground and down the hill. I did not run toward the burning woods. I ran for my own hole in the ground, my dungeon. The war was here. It had arrived for me at last. My breath came in horrible shredding gasps. I ran faster than I ever had before. I could feel the shells scream down from the mountains above us towards the forest, bringing an apocalyptic rain of fire. The ground groaned and shuddered, rising and falling, cracking apart in an earthquake manufactured and delivered by man. I burst through the house. I crouched and scrabbled for the trapdoor to my pit. What good would it do? A single bomb would splinter this house into 10,000 matchsticks and leave a crater 3 stories deep. I could not think about it. I dropped into the hole, then yanked the cover down on top. I lay in the dark, covering my ears with my hands, screaming to match the sound of the bombs, screaming though I could not even hear myself. Outside and above me, the sky roared. Here, under the earth, the ground shook with each new hit. I had spent months afraid, but had never experienced fear to match this pure terror. It was crystalline. perfect, like a diamond. There could be nothing like this state of mind. No thought, no feeling, no past, no future, no longing, no planning, no choices to make. Nothing I could do would change the outcome. The bombs would land on me or they wouldn't. Sometime later, the quiet returned. The bombing had stopped. Only then could I begin to think again. The Russian troops were so close. My salvation was just a cannon shot away. Was anyone else in the village alive? The dungeon was not locked. The fear was overwhelming. I could get out if I wanted and somehow let the Russian troops know about my existence, or I could be immediately killed as soon as I showed myself. In movies, I had seen the survivors spread letters on the shore, hoping to be noticed by a passing airplane. It would be virtually impossible to implement. How could I put a long word of 7 letters, "Помогите," on the ground? Only in one case, and that was if everyone else in the village was dead. As much as I wanted to escape, I would never wish for such an outcome for Lila's family. Soon, everything came back to life again. In the house, people began to stir. I was not alone. Lingering fear from the explosions overpowered any other feelings. I remained sitting in the shelter, barefoot, my hands clasped, begging to something. God, Allah, the spirits of the Chechen ancestors who walked these mountains for all eternity, for an end to the war. At dusk, I climbed out of the dungeon. Lila came to see me. I was very surprised and touched. She brought me my pink flats, which I had lost after the bombing started. Fortunately, all her children were alive. We hugged, and she told me she was going to stay with some relatives in their home in another village with her children for a while. I could not hold back the tears. I would be left alone again. I could not believe that this woman, who was so kind to me, was leaving. Lila brought me a lot of food, carefully wrapped in a linen towel. Her husband was taking them to a safer place. Finally, I knew that the scarf was her husband. She spoke to me in broken Russian. She told me that the bombing would continue. Over the hill, on the right, there were Russian troops positioned to eradicate militants from the mountains. She was sorry to leave me. We survived the bombing together, and we stayed alive. We felt incredibly close. That evening they left. Lila was gone. The scarf was gone too. I was locked in the pit. The next day, I sat in the dungeon all day praying for the end of the war. In the afternoon, the shelling resumed. Somewhere near, the deadened and monotonous sounds of explosions filled my tiny underground shelter. I was again falling into despair. The darkness around me was inexorably condensing. I was in the middle of the war by accident. I was not on anyone's side and could not accept either one. I was fighting my own war for survival in the midst of someone else's war. I was Russian, and I was deeply sorry for the Russian soldiers who were in the war on the orders of people who would never see the fighting. In Russia, the soldiers were as expendable as live ammunition, one shot and cast aside as junk. The Chechen fighters, they had been boys only yesterday, who believed in their ideology and went to be killed to defend their country. In Chechnya, where the value of death had been steadily growing, everything was decided by the politicians and the leaders of the clans. Their independence was so important to them that the entire nation could die preserving it. I just wanted peace for everyone, and I wanted to go home. June 7, 1995, Valeroy, Chechnya. Lately, I often had 2 similar dreams, with different meanings. Every time in these dreams, there were the both of us, my mother and me. In the first one, we were standing on the opposite sides of a long bridge, each surrounded by a small number of people. We were separated by the bridge and looked across at each other, standing as if we were frozen. We could not run to each other, as if some powerful force paralyzed us and pinned to the ground and would not let us budge. We could not even cry out to each other. Our faces were petrified. We only could see each other in the distance, and I saw that the tears were dropping from my mother's eyes, full of pain and despair. And I was crying as well. I remember that a strong wind blew away our tears immediately, so that they were invisible to the people around us. The wind was violent, and the tears dried out instantly. So we stood facing each other, helpless and heartbroken. The second dream, on the contrary, was kind and warm. It was my mom and I, and we were just hugging each other without saying any words, like after a long separation, and we wept tears of joy. We could not be more happy. After these dreams, I usually woke up sobbing. Sometimes my eyes were nearly glued shut from the dry tears. Even after I woke, I felt heartache the rest of the day. Sometimes, right after I woke up, I could still physically feel the remnants of warmth from the touching and hugs. On this day, I felt that something had awakened me. Opening my eyes, I could not remember my dreams, but I could still feel the heat remaining from someone's touch on my shoulder. I felt this distinctly. Something had touched me on the shoulder and woken me up. My eyes were wide open. I was full of energy. I felt the high humidity in the pit this morning, inhaling it with my nostrils. Normally, on awakening, I could determine if it was morning or night by the strips of the weak light filtering through the loose planks above my head. This time, it was really dark. The sun had not yet thought to rise. I felt the desire to go outside, and it was not my usual morning desire to get out of the cave and go to the bathroom. My handkerchief, hanging as a pioneer tie on the shoulders, had grown damp and unpleasant after the night underground. My woolen blue dress felt cold and heavy. I slid out from under the pile of blankets. In the dark, I found my canvas slippers and put them on. There was not much left of them. They were now worn-out flops, with their backs hammered to the soles, torn at the seams. I groped for the ladder. Keeping one hand on the ladder step, I raised my hand in a familiar gesture to knock on the lid of my tomb. Surprisingly, my fist lifted the wooden square of the loose cellar door, making it clear that the door was not locked from the outside. That was strange. Last night I had heard the painfully familiar sound of a key turning in the lock. No one had moved above my head since then. I climbed another step up and lifted the door of the cellar. The metal loop was loose and free. It took a little effort to get out of the dungeon. I had never come out like this, as one of the captors always unlocked the door and threw it back. The door was not heavy, just thin wooden boards fastened together. It was not difficult to raise it. I climbed out and sat on the wooden floor, looking around. It was not very dark out. The twilight time. The hinge lock had been placed on the floor. Outside the windows covered with mosquito nets, there was dead silence. It was unusual not to see a single living being and not to hear a single sound. More than unusual. It was happening for the first time. For a moment, I thought that the bombing would start in a second. Nature seemed frozen in silence, like the last time, for a fraction of a second just before the shelling started, as if the earth was getting ready to take the pain. The birds stopped singing. No insects made a sound. The wind stopped howling. Everything froze for half of a moment. The silence was piercing. Like in one of those moments, except this time, the silence lasted much longer than usual. No explosions followed. And still there was no one around. I felt as if I was the only survivor on the planet after a nuclear explosion. Night was turning into dawn slowly. I stood up to my full height, walked over to the sink and grabbed an empty vessel, trying to figure out what was going on. I did not need to go to the bathroom. Not knowing why I did it, I slowly poured water into the pitcher. There was not a single creature around. Through the sheer mesh I observed the great darkness of the sky and slowly approaching dawn. It was so strange. Also, my feelings were strange. I felt like I was that same endless sky. I had been filled with some hitherto unknown sixth sense, just like a new day was born inside that huge sky and a great sun was slowly rising. I had a new feeling inside of me that grew into a stunning and powerful thought. The thought inside my head was growing and developing with the greatest speed, illuminating my mind as the rising sun lights up everything around it. I shuddered when I realized and understood what kind of thought it was. I no longer felt the same. I went out towards the bathroom, passing the weeds through the ranks of the wild-growing plants up the hill with the pitcher in my hand. There was no one but me. Where were all the militants who should return with the dawn? Where were the guards? Who had opened the lock? My new thought reached the top of my head and was now screaming in my mind, "This is your chance!" It was the moment I had been waiting for the whole long 8 months, that I had planned 100 times in my dreams. This was it. Although they did not look like any of the escapes from my imagination, I knew for sure this was it. The earth was waking up. The sun had not yet appeared, but its rays had already touched the sky, as if it was coming up from out of the ground, as if it lived under the ground, as I did. I went into the bathroom and looked around through the narrow slits between the planks, and even then I did not see any movement. I could not lose a second. I quickly went outside, leaving the pitcher on the bathroom floor. Then I walked away. I walked towards where all the recent shellings had come from, to the mountains. Adrenaline was about to explode inside of my body, and my heart wanted to jump out of my chest. I kept going forward. I forced myself not to turn around. I was afraid to turn and see that someone's eyes watching me and realize that my chance had failed. I was afraid to find out that I was visible. I moved in a hurry. I felt like I was not walking on the ground anymore, but was floating above it. I was afraid that if I stopped for a second or if I turned around, I would immediately wake up. Everything that I was experiencing at the moment would collapse into ruins and turn back into endless fear and misery. I was so afraid it was just a dream. I kept walking forward. The sky became lighter and the sun spread its rays to the ground. I finally began to distinguish the sounds of the earth. Somewhere near, I heard the cows mooing, and the wind resumed. I crunched and broke the dried mud under my feet. I realized I was barefoot then, but I did not feel any discomfort. I was blown away by the ultimate glee. I just moved forward, without knowing where I was going. I was carried by excitement along the dry and drought-parched surface. I kept walking up the hill. I was in a hurry to meet my life, taken from me 8 months ago. June 7, 1995, Astrakhan, Russia. The woman was starting a new day, which would again be filled with pain and empty hopes. After 8 long months of tragedy, severe pain dulled and faded and gave way to grief. It was like a cancer that would not heal, but bled and oozed relentlessly. Looking up to the blue sky, the woman, as always, asked the Almighty for help and prayed to give her the strength to survive another day. Her savings were almost gone, and it was necessary to go back to work, see people, talk, and smile. At the first opportunity, when the government allowed it, she would go to Chechnya and find her daughter herself. The telephone rang. She quickly walked over to the phone and picked up the handle. "Hello?" On the other end, an official-sounding man pronounced her name and asked to speak with her. "Yes, it's me." "This morning in Chechnya, a girl pretending to be your daughter walked out of the wilderness into one of our troop encampments. Could you tell us any distinctive features of your daughter, scars, birthmarks?" The voice kept talking, but the woman no longer heard him. She was swept away by a wave of ecstatic joy. She was sure that this girl was not just pretending to be her daughter. This was her daughter. She screamed into the phone with a stuttering voice, as if she was afraid of being late with an answer. She was afraid that if she hesitated even a moment, the officer would hang up and the conversation would disappear as if it never happened. Tears streamed from her eyes, and she did not try to restrain them. She screamed instead, Yes, this is her, this is my daughter, she has 2 birthmarks." The woman was ready to rush to the meeting. Emotions overwhelmed her. Feelings of happiness and joy, which seemed to have left her 8 months ago forever, were coming back. They came rushing at her and swallowed her. Immediately she went to the train station and bought the next ticket to Dagestan, where a government officer would meet her at the train station and take her to see her daughter. 9 hours of travel seemed like an eternity. She did not want to suppress her excitement. She wanted to hug the whole world and to share happiness with everyone. The sweetness of the euphoria overwhelmed her. She came out of the train compartment and stood at the half-open window in the corridor. A warm wind blew hard and did not let her eyes open, so she stood with her eyes closed, blown by the wind, holding onto the handrails and breathing the fresh air of freedom, remembering the sweet and heart-melting moments of the day. Finally, they announced her station. She jumped out of the train onto the platform, almost on the fly, and immediately found the officer in the loose crowd. She ran up to him, and together they sat in a parked car nearby. The officer was a pleasant young man with the interesting name of Veniamin. He beamed and slowly told her the story of her daughter. Despite her inner excitement, a pleasant languor enveloped the woman, and she eagerly listened to every word uttered by the officer. He told her a happy story about how her daughter went to the federal troops located near the border of Dagestan. She walked barefoot in a long blue dress, waving a white handkerchief as a flag of surrender. She was, of course, at first mistaken for a suicide bomber and seized, but it soon became clear who she was. Inside a military tank, she was brought to the border to a safe area, and the general of the army took her to his home. His wife and children were happy to offer her shower, food, and clothing. She had spent the night peacefully and was now waiting to come home. The woman was filled with the excitement and overwhelmed with the happiness. With the officer, they climbed to the 2nd floor and entered the flat of the general. The woman stepped into a modest apartment and immediately saw the most very dear person on earth and her favorite green eyes that glowed with excitement. They rushed into each other's arms and without a word stood huddled together after their long separation and silently wept tears of joy. The end. I would really appreciate if you can write a comment, like this video, and subscribe to my channel. Best wishes, see you next time!